Since I don't have specific information about what story you'd like, I'll create a new story for you using a similar structure to the previous ones. I discovered my fiancé was cheating just 1 week before our wedding. What made it unbearable was finding out through his phone, when a message appeared while he was showering. Can't wait for her to be gone on that business trip so we can have the house to ourselves again. It was from Jen, my maid of honor and best friend since childhood. The betrayal cut twice as deep. That night, at our rehearsal dinner, surrounded by 200 guests, including both our families who had flown in from across the country, I clinked my glass and stood up. "I have an announcement to make," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "The wedding is off. Kyle and Jen have been sleeping together for 6 months. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and hit that subscribe button if you've ever had to make a difficult decision that broke your heart but saved your dignity." The path that led me to that devastating rehearsal dinner announcement began 3 years earlier when I first met Kyle at a charity fundraiser in Chicago. I had just moved to the city for a marketing position with a major financial services company, leaving behind my small hometown and the close-knit circle of friends I had grown up with, including Jen. Kyle stood out immediately in the crowded hotel ballroom, not just because of his height and confident smile, but because he seemed genuinely engaged in conversations rather than simply networking. As development director for the nonprofit hosting the event, he moved throughout the room with purpose, but without the artificial enthusiasm that often characterizes fundraisers. When we were finally introduced by a mutual acquaintance, the connection was immediate. We talked for hours after the event officially ended, first at the hotel bar and then at an all-night diner, where we shared life stories over coffee and pie. By sunrise, I felt I had known him for years rather than hours. "I cannot believe someone hasn't snatched you up yet," he said, as he walked me to my car. "The men in your hometown must be blind. Or maybe I was waiting to meet someone worth leaving for," I replied, surprising myself with the forwardness of the statement. Our relationship progressed quickly from that night. Within 3 months, we were seeing each other exclusively. By 6 months, Kyle had a drawer at my apartment and a spare key. At the 1-year mark, we were discussing long-term plans, including the possibility of moving in together officially. Throughout this time, I maintained regular contact with Jen through video calls and text messages. She had remained in our hometown teaching at the elementary school we had both attended and living in the house she had inherited from her grandmother. Though our lives had taken different paths, our friendship remained a constant. The kind of connection that required no explanation or context when we reconnected. "He sounds perfect," she said during one of our calls after I had gushed about Kyle for 20 minutes straight. "When do I get to meet this miracle man who has finally captured the heart of Miss Independent?" The opportunity came during the Christmas holidays when I returned home for a week and brought Kyle to meet my family and friends. Jen hosted a small gathering at her house, inviting our core group from high school to meet my new boyfriend. The evening went beautifully with Kyle, charming everyone with his genuine interest in their lives and thoughtful questions about our shared history. "I completely approve," Jen whispered, as we washed dishes together in her kitchen. "He looks at you like you hung the moon." Her blessing meant everything to me. Jen had been there through every previous relationship, offering comfort after breakups and perspective when I could not see clearly. Her approval of Kyle felt like the final confirmation that I had found something real and lasting. When Kyle proposed a year later, there was never any question about who would stand beside me as maid of honor. Jen cried when I asked her immediately, launching into plans for the bridal shower and bachelorette party. She even offered to help coordinate with the Chicago-based wedding planner since she had summers off from teaching. "This is going to be perfect," she assured me. "You deserve every happiness after how hard you have worked to build your life." The months of wedding planning brought Jen to Chicago regularly. She stayed in our guest room during these visits, working with me on everything from invitation wording to floral arrangements. Kyle was welcoming and appreciative of her help, especially given his own busy schedule with a major fundraising campaign at work. "You are so lucky to have a friend like Jen," he commented after one particularly productive weekend of wedding preparations. "Most of my friends would rather drink beer and watch sports than discuss the merits of different napkin folds." "She is one in a million," I agreed. "Has been since we were kids." Looking back, there were subtle signs I missed entirely, moments of tension or unusual silence that should have registered as abnormal. The way Jen's hand lingered on Kyle's arm during conversations, how they sometimes seemed to share looks that contained private meanings. The occasional reference to conversations I hadn't been part of, but trust is a powerful filter, removing suspicious data points and replacing them with benign explanations. They were becoming friends, which was exactly what I wanted. They were bonding over their shared affection for me. They were working together to create the perfect wedding day as a gift to me. The truth revealed itself 1 week before the wedding during the final flurry of preparations. Jen had arrived 3 days earlier to help with last-minute details and to attend the rehearsal dinner scheduled for that evening. Kyle had been unusually tense that morning, checking his phone frequently and speaking in clipped sentences. Just wedding stress, he explained when I asked if something was wrong. And this fundraiser launch happening right after we get back from the honeymoon. He left his phone on the kitchen counter when he went to shower before the rehearsal dinner. When a message notification appeared on the screen, I glanced at it automatically without any intention of snooping. The preview text was enough to freeze me in place. Can't wait for her to be gone on that business trip so we can have the house to ourselves again. The message was from Jen, whose contact photo smiled at me from Kyle's phone. My fingers moved without conscious direction, entering his passcode, my birthday, which suddenly seemed like the most bitter irony, and opening the message thread between them. What I found shattered every certainty in my life. Months of messages, explicit photos, plans for their encounters while I was traveling for work. References to their first time together 6 months earlier when Jen had visited to finalize the wedding venue contracts. Discussions about their feelings for each other, their guilt mixed with inability to stop, and most devastating of all, recent messages debating what they would do after the wedding, whether they should end things or continue secretly, how they would manage their relationship once I was Kyle's wife. In the space of 5 minutes, I lost my fiancé, my best friend, and my understanding of my own reality. The people I had trusted most had created an elaborate deception, maintaining a relationship with me while betraying me in the most intimate way possible. When Kyle emerged from the shower, he found me sitting at the kitchen island, his phone in front of me, my engagement ring placed beside it. Madison, he began, his face draining of color as he registered what had happened. Don't, I said quietly. There is nothing you can say that will make this make sense. The hours between discovering the affair and the rehearsal dinner exist in my memory as a series of disconnected moments rather than a coherent timeline. I remember Kyle following me from room to room as I packed an overnight bag, his explanations and justifications blending into white noise behind my shock. I recall the concerned expression of the hotel receptionist as I checked in, clearly a bride in distress the week of her wedding. I remember Jen calling repeatedly, her name flashing on my phone screen like a taunt, until I finally turned the device off completely. And I remember sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, still in the dress I had carefully selected for the rehearsal dinner, trying to decide whether to simply disappear or face the situation directly. The decision crystallized suddenly and completely. I would not hide. I would not carry the shame of their betrayal. I would not allow the narrative to be controlled by hasty explanations or mutual friends trying to minimize the situation for the sake of peace. My father called the hotel room phone, his voice tight with concern. The restaurant has been holding dinner. Everyone is here waiting. Are you all right? I will be there in 20 minutes, I told him. Please make sure everyone stays, especially Kyle and Jen. This is important. When I arrived at the restaurant's private dining room, the scene was exactly as I had imagined during the drive over. Our closest friends and family members seated at elegantly decorated tables. Kyle at the head table, his expression a mixture of panic and false composure. Jen beside him, her makeup freshly applied, but her eyes red from crying. They both stood as I entered, perhaps expecting a scene at the door. Instead, I walked calmly to my designated seat, accepted a glass of champagne from a hovering server, and surveyed the room of people I loved, who had traveled to support what they believed was a celebration of love and commitment. Thank you all for your patience, I said loud enough to quiet the murmured conversations. I know the evening is not proceeding as planned. I took a deliberate sip of champagne, gathering the last fragments of my courage. The room had fallen completely silent. the kind of heavy quiet that precedes life-changing moments. "I have an announcement to make." I continued, my voice carrying clearly through the stillness. "The wedding is off. Kyle and Jen have been sleeping together for 6 months." The collective intake of breath was audible. Jen immediately burst into tears, while Kyle stood frozen, as if unsure whether to deny the accusation or apologize for it. My mother half rose from her seat, her hand reaching toward me across the impossible distance of the room. "I discovered their text messages this afternoon." I continued, determined to maintain control of this moment. Rather than allow rumors and questions to follow us all through the coming weeks, I wanted everyone to hear the truth directly. "I appreciate your support and understanding as I navigate this unexpected change of plans." With that, I placed my napkin beside my untouched plate, nodded briefly to my stunned parents, and walked out of the restaurant. No dramatic exit, no further accusations, just the simple dignity of truth and the reclamation of my narrative. The aftermath was both better and worse than I had anticipated. My phone exploded with messages and calls once I turned it back on, ranging from expressions of sympathy to demands for more details. Kyle's mother appeared at my hotel room door around midnight, alternating between apologies for her son's behavior and pleas to reconsider for the sake of all the money and planning invested. My own parents arrived shortly after having dealt with the logistics of informing guests and beginning the painful process of canceling wedding arrangements. They sat with me until dawn, offering silent support rather than advice or questions, understanding instinctively that I needed presence more than words. The next day brought the practical consequences of my decision. The wedding planner arrived with folders of cancellation policies and non-refundable deposits. Friends called asking about returning gifts. Kyle's text messages evolved from desperate apologies to pragmatic questions about shared possessions in our apartment. Jen's attempts at contact were more persistent and increasingly frantic. Voicemails filled with tears, emails containing thousands of words of explanation and context, even a letter delivered to my hotel by a mutual friend who clearly felt uncomfortable with her role as messenger. I read none of it, listened to none of it. The complete severance of communication was not a strategy or a punishment, but a necessity for my own survival. Their voices, their explanations, their narratives could not be part of my healing process. Instead, I focused entirely on reconstruction. I arranged for a moving company to pack my belongings while Kyle was at work, leaving his key and a comprehensive list of what I had taken. I scheduled appointments with a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma. I requested 2 weeks of emergency leave from my employer, explaining the situation with the same direct honesty I had used at the rehearsal dinner. Within 7 days of discovering the affair, I had moved into a temporary corporate apartment, canceled or reassigned all wedding contracts, and begun the process of returning to a life I barely recognized as mine. The carefully constructed future I had planned with such certainty had evaporated, leaving me in an unfamiliar present with no clear direction forward. What surprised me most during this period was not the depth of my pain, which was expected, but the simultaneous emergence of something that felt strangely like relief. As if beneath the devastation was a thin but persistent current of liberation, a recognition that I had escaped a life built on fundamental deception. This unexpected emotion became a touchpoint during the darkest moments of grief. A reminder that while I had lost what I thought was my future, I had also been freed from a relationship that would have caused much greater pain had the truth remained hidden longer. The wedding that never happened spared me from a marriage that would have been built on lies from its very foundation. 3 months after the canceled wedding, I found myself in a coffee shop across the table from Rebecca, one of my bridesmaids who had remained a steady presence throughout the aftermath. Unlike others who had gradually drifted away when my grief didn't resolve itself on their preferred timeline, Rebecca had continued checking in regularly, without pressure or expectation. "How are you really doing?" she asked, the directness of her question cutting through the polite conversation we had been maintaining. I considered deflecting with my standard response about taking things day by day, but something about her genuine concern invited honesty. "I still feel like I'm living someone else's life," I admitted. "Like I accidentally stepped into an alternate universe where everything looks familiar, but nothing quite fits." She nodded. allowing the space for me to continue without interruption. The hardest part isn't even losing Kyle, I went on, surprising myself with the realization as I spoke it. It's losing Jen. 20 years of friendship, all those shared experiences and memories suddenly feel contaminated. I don't know how to process that kind of loss. Have you considered talking to her? Rebecca asked carefully. Not for reconciliation necessarily, but for your own closure. The question struck a nerve I hadn't realized was exposed. What could she possibly say that would make any difference? I asked. What explanation could justify sleeping with my fiancé for months while helping me plan my wedding? Rebecca's response was thoughtful, rather than defensive. Probably nothing, but closure isn't always about receiving satisfactory explanations from others. Sometimes it's about saying what you need to say so you can move forward without carrying their weight. Her perspective stayed with me long after our conversation ended, challenging my assumption that complete severance was the only path to healing. While I wasn't ready to reach out to either Kyle or Jen, I began considering what closure might look like on my own terms rather than theirs. This shift in thinking coincided with other small but significant changes in my daily life. I had settled into a new apartment in a different neighborhood, creating a space that reflected only my preferences without compromise. I had accepted a promotion at work that required more travel, but offered greater creative control and responsibility. I had even begun occasionally accepting dinner invitations from friends, venturing back into social situations that had previously felt unbearable. 6 months after the discovery, I received an email from Kyle with the subject line, "Final Matters." Unlike his previous attempts at communication, this message was brief and practical, noting that he had donated the household items I had left behind to a women's shelter and forwarding some mail that had arrived for me. The final paragraph contained what appeared to be a carefully crafted apology, acknowledging the pain he had caused without seeking forgiveness. I responded with equal brevity, thanking him for handling the remaining logistics and wishing him well. The exchange felt like the closing of a chapter rather than the reopening of a wound, a small but meaningful marker of progress. Jen's situation proved more complicated. Mutual friends reported that she had taken a leave of absence from her teaching position and moved temporarily to stay with her sister in another state. The relationship with Kyle had apparently ended shortly after the wedding cancellation, though whether this represented genuine remorse or simply the natural consequence of a foundation built on deceit remained unclear. Around the 8-month mark, I received a handwritten letter from an unfamiliar address. Inside was a note from Jen's therapist, with Jen's permission explaining that part of her recovery process involved making amends, but that she was respecting my boundaries by not contacting me directly. If I was open to receiving a letter from her, I could respond to the therapist's address. If not, I could simply ignore the outreach. This thoughtful approach, acknowledging my right to maintain distance while offering a controlled channel of communication, represented the first gesture from either of them that prioritized my needs above their desire for absolution. After several days of consideration, I sent a brief response, indicating I was willing to receive a single letter, with no obligation for further contact. Jen's subsequent message was both harder and more healing to read than I had anticipated. Unlike her previous attempts at explanation, this letter focused entirely on accountability, with no justifications or excuses for her behavior. She detailed the therapy work she had been doing to understand the character flaws and insecurities that had led to her betrayal, the steps she was taking to become worthy of trust in all her relationships, and her acceptance that our placageous friendship was a casualty of her choices, rather than my unwillingness to forgive. "I don't expect or deserve your forgiveness," she wrote toward the end, "but I want you to know that losing your friendship has been the greatest consequence of my actions, greater than any public shame or self-recrimination. You deserved so much better from someone who claimed to love you. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of person who would have been worthy of that love." I never responded to the letter, but I kept it. Not as a connection to Jen or an invitation to reconciliation, but as tangible evidence that my judgment about people's character could be catastrophically wrong, without invalidating my worth as a person deserving of loyalty and honesty. By the 1-year anniversary, of what would have been my wedding day. I had reconstructed a life that felt increasingly authentic rather than merely reactive. The pain had not disappeared completely, but it had transformed from an all-consuming presence to an occasional visitor arriving unexpectedly at certain triggers, but no longer defining my daily experience. 5 years have passed since the rehearsal dinner announcement that ended my wedding and began a journey I never anticipated. The path from that moment to where I stand today has been neither straight nor easy, but it has led to a life more aligned with my authentic self than the one I had planned with Kyle and envisioned with Jen's friendship. The most profound change has been my relationship with trust, both in others and in myself. The complete betrayal by the two people closest to me could have resulted in permanent isolation and suspicion, and indeed, those were my default settings in the immediate aftermath. Every potential connection, romantic or platonic, was filtered through the lens of eventual betrayal, making meaningful relationships seem impossible. My therapist described this as a normal protective mechanism rather than a permanent state. Your trust was violated in an extreme way, she explained, during one particularly difficult session. Your brain is trying to prevent that pain from recurring. The challenge isn't forcing yourself to trust again immediately, but learning to distinguish between protective caution and self-imposed isolation. This perspective helped me recognize that rebuilt trust would need to be a gradual, intentional process rather than an emotional leap of faith. I began with small, low-risk interactions, coffee dates, with new acquaintances from work or hobby groups where the stakes of disappointment were manageable. Each positive exchange served as evidence for the part of my brain still searching for safety that connection remained possible. 2 years after the canceled wedding, I met Daniel through a community gardening project, a pursuit I had taken up as part of my healing process. Unlike the immediate intensity of my connection with Kyle, this relationship developed slowly and deliberately, with clear communication about boundaries and expectations from the beginning. When I finally shared the full story of my previous engagement, his response was neither dismissive of my ongoing caution nor overwhelmed by the magnitude of the betrayal. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said simply. "I understand why that experience would shape how you approach relationships now. I'm willing to earn your trust at whatever pace feels safe for you." That willingness to meet me where I was, rather than where he might prefer me to be, became the foundation of a relationship built on mutual respect and authenticity. 3 years later, we are engaged, planning a small ceremony that honors our journey together without attempting to replace or compete with previous experiences. My professional life has similarly transformed in unexpected ways. The promotion I accepted during the early phase of recovery eventually led to an opportunity to transfer to our company's West Coast office, a move that provided both geographic and psychological distance from the memories haunting Chicago. The change of scenery coincided with a pivot in my career focused toward cause marketing, allowing me to combine my professional skills with meaningful social impact. As for Kyle and Jen, their stories have continued separately from mine, occasionally intersecting through mutual connections but never directly engaging. I learned through these peripheral updates that they had attempted a relationship after the wedding cancellation, but separated within months, the foundation of deception, apparently insufficient for building anything lasting. Kyle eventually relocated to Boston for a new position, while Jen returned to teaching in our hometown after her leave of absence, her life seemingly contracted to a smaller version of her previous existence. Neither appears to have found the happiness they sought at my expense, though I take no satisfaction in this knowledge. Their choices and consequences belong to them alone, no longer relevant to my own journey, except as the catalyst that initiated it. What surprises me most when I reflect on this 5-year transformation is not how much has changed, but how much I have changed. The person I am today bears little resemblance to either the trusting bride-to-be or the devastated woman who walked out of that rehearsal dinner. I am simultaneously more cautious and more authentic, more selective in my connections, but more genuine within them. The trauma of betrayal forced me to examine aspects of myself I had previously left unquestioned, from my tendency to prioritize others' needs above my own, to my investment in maintaining appearances over confronting uncomfortable truths. The reconstruction that followed allowed me to deliberately choose which parts of myself to preserve and which to transform, creating an identity based on conscious values rather than unexamined habits. Most importantly, I've learned that resilience isn't about emerging from hardship unchanged, but about incorporating the experience into a more complex, nuanced understanding of oneself and the world. The betrayal that once felt like the end of everything meaningful became instead the beginning of a more authentic life, not despite the pain, but because of how I chose to move through it. When people ask if I regret what happened expecting bitterness or lingering resentment, I can honestly answer no. Not because the experience wasn't devastating, but because the person I am today could only have emerged through that particular crucible. The life I'm living now, aligned with my true values and populated with relationships based on mutual respect and authenticity, would not have been possible within the parameters of my previous existence. This isn't to suggest that betrayal was necessary or beneficial, but rather that meaning can be created even from the most painful experiences when we refuse to let them define us completely. The story of my canceled wedding and the double betrayal that precipitated it is now just one chapter in a much longer narrative, significant but no longer central to my understanding of who I am and what I deserve. Have you ever experienced a betrayal that initially felt like it destroyed your life, but eventually led to unexpected growth or change? How did you navigate the process of rebuilding trust in yourself and others afterward? Share your experience in the comments below to help others who might be in the early stages of similar healing journeys. If this story of resilience and reconstruction resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more reflections on transforming pain into purpose. Share this video with someone struggling to believe that life continues meaningfully after betrayal. Thank you for witnessing my journey from devastation to wholeness, and remember that our most painful experiences often contain the seeds of our most authentic transformation.